Hello, community. To be honest, I never planned to share this story, but circumstances forced me to. My early years and upbringing were very different from what my peers had. I always saw myself as an ordinary child. I adored my parents and strived to be exemplary. But what does exemplary mean? And how do you realize that even an exemplary person can simply be erased from life? As a child, I fantasized about a family from the movies, a cozy cottage, cheerful conversations, celebrations where everyone helps each other. We seemed to have such a cottage. My father appeared stern but sometimes kind, my mother affectionate but with a sly streak. I remember those days. I quietly solved problems off to the side, heard how Thomas, my older brother, bragged about excellent grades, how Sophia, my sister, earned compliments for her music or paintings. And me, I just existed. Like a decoration, I tried to stand out, helped my parents, excelled in school, competed in school events. But all my successes, approvals, and efforts seemed to dissolve into thin air. My brother was considered flawless, and my parents emphasized that at every turn. Sophia was my mother's favorite, attractive, sociable, always in the spotlight. And me, I seemed like a backup player. I remember my mother's words when I turned 13. "You know, dear, you're so quiet. I hope someday you'll achieve something significant." I smiled and agreed, but inside I felt a vacuum. It didn't sound like encouragement. It foreshadowed that I'd never be truly appreciated. Time flew by. I graduated from university, found a job, developed my career. I seemed to become a mature, independent individual. But the resentment and feeling of being unnecessary didn't disappear. Any contacts with my parents, stories about my affairs, invitations to dinner, were always met with almost complete indifference. They admired Thomas and Sophia and bypassed me in silence. I thought, fine, I don't need their approval, I'll make it on my own. And I did. But everything flipped in an instant when a notification from the lawyer arrived. It was official, impassive, emotionless. "Dear Mr. Narrator's name, according to the latest version of your parents' will, you are not included in the list of heirs to their property." I reread the line multiple times. At first, I didn't believe it. Then rage flooded in, replaced by emptiness. My heart pounded as if all foundations had been ripped out. How is this possible? The people who gave me life completely cut me off. That night, I was in my home, surrounded by books, photos from my youth, worn utensils, and for the first time in many years, I sobbed. The feeling of betrayal and loss mixed with a strange liberation. Now no one could influence me through capital or inheritance. The following days were tough. I tried to figure out why it happened. I talked to my brother and sister. They were shocked. But my parents gave no explanations. Every contact remained unanswered. Every meeting ended in icy silence. About 2 years passed, and suddenly a call came. It was my mom on the line. Her voice trembled. We need your support. We really need it." I froze. This is the same woman who excluded me from the will. The one who neglected my achievements, who made me invisible. Now she's asking. I hung up to calm down. A storm of anger, skepticism, and emotional turmoil overwhelmed me. But intuition suggested it's worth finding out the details. A couple of days later, I met them in a neutral place. Their appearance had changed, not the usual detached gaze, but worried, confused faces. Mom and Dad told me what they had hidden for decades. Obligations, the threat of business collapse, medical expenses. Their financial situation was dire. They had created a facade of a prosperous, confident dynasty, but in reality, everything was crumbling. And now they needed a savior. I listened and thought, so that's it. Their true motive, money. They don't need my care. They need my skills and knowledge. And then I realized I have influence. Influence over those who once caused me suffering. I could choose one of two options: forgive and help, or punish. I chose to help first, not out of compassion, but to dictate terms. I offered restructuring obligations, legal assistance, budget oversight. My parents were embarrassed but agreed. Things went on for months. I delved into their reports, papers, credit agreements. I often stayed up at night thinking about how fragile their reality was. I noticed the fear, shame, and at the same time, efforts to mask vulnerabilities. My parents showed weakness for the first time, and it was an unusual, almost surreal experience. With every conversation and contact, I felt power and dominance. My career and life, which they had rejected, now became their salvation. They began to respect what they had previously despised. After a few months, we achieved improvements. Obligations restructured, health bills covered, a segment of the business preserved. But the key thing, I saw their transformation. Fear and arrogance were replaced by cautious respect. I maintained detachment. None of them could make me feel unnecessary anymore. Now dominance was mine. And then the unexpected happened. Mom said, "We were wrong, I was wrong all these years." Simple words, but for me, they meant a lot. Acknowledgement of mistakes. Acknowledgement that I deserve respect and affection that they had hidden from me for so long. I looked at them and remembered the past, about how decades of suffering and neglect had hardened me, about how I survived alone. And in that moment I understood, power isn't in punishment. Power is in choice, in controlling your fate and the ability to set boundaries. My saga isn't over yet. The next steps will be complex. I had to decide whether to include myself in the will, what to do with my brother and sister, how to maintain respect and detachment. But one thing I understood firmly, I will never be unnecessary again. After I helped my parents normalize their financial affairs, it seemed like the pressure should ease. But intuition whispered that this was just the start. For the first time, I realized that I could direct events, but with that came the understanding. Full trust in them is impossible. They had always masterfully influenced, even without words. At first, I watched them vigilantly. Every gesture, every expression, every movement, now read like an open book. I discerned panic in their eyes, efforts to hide fragility, but also noticed regret and genuine repentance. They depended on me, and this feeling of dominance was unfamiliar, almost intoxicating. Mom called one evening. "We want to express gratitude for everything. Without you, we would have," she faltered. "I know," I replied restrainedly. "But gratitude isn't enough. Words fix nothing. Actions matter." My voice sounded cool. I didn't want them to think I'd easily forgive. I felt the need to set norms of behavior, and they had to accept them. The following weeks I spent analyzing legal papers. I discovered that their will wasn't just a document, it was a tool of dominance. They had completely erased me, and my brother and sister took all the assets, including the house, company, and investments. I realized, if I wanted to punish, it would be easy. I had the data, expertise, and leverage to break their schemes. But punishment wasn't in my plans. I aimed for more, respect. So they would understand the price I paid for independence, and so they couldn't bypass me anymore. I started small, adjusted the obligation restructuring scheme. I demanded that all decisions go through me. Any significant financial transaction needed my approval. My parents, who previously rejected my advice, now had to listen. One evening, when we were reviewing the company, my father, usually detached and self-assured, looked at me and said, "You're really stronger than we thought." I caught a slight tremor in his tone. It was an acknowledgement, though restrained. I nodded without smiling. But dominance isn't just oversight of capital. It's managing emotions, history. I began recalling every episode when they hurt me, every remark, every glance, every underestimation. And I understood. I can use this to shape a new atmosphere. I could set boundaries that once seemed unattainable. The next maneuver was risky. I suggested they include me in the will again, but on my terms. "I can help you," I said, "but if you want my involvement in the future, changes need to be made." They were silent. A long pause. I saw anxiety in their eyes. This was a game they had never played before. "Okay," Mom finally said, "we're ready." With this agreement came not relief, but a new burden. I realized that now I stood at a crossroads, on one side, family on the other, my values and personal freedom. Weeks passed, I monitored their actions. Sometimes old patterns surfaced, efforts to influence, evade conversations, hide details. And I understood, trust is earned, and they had to prove the changes. During that same period, I confronted my brother and sister. They were surprised by my return to the family game. Thomas, my older brother, seemed annoyed. "What have you achieved?" he asked with a hint of contempt. "Dominance over what truly matters," I replied evenly. "And by the way, it's none of your business." Sophia was more tactful. "We just want harmony." "Harmony is when everyone knows their boundaries," I said. These conversations weren't ordinary family squabbles. It was a test. a test of who now truly holds weight and whose decisions will matter. Gradually, I began noticing how my parents were transforming. They were learning to collaborate with me, listen, acknowledge my successes. It was unusual, almost unreal, to see people who once ignored your existence now asking for opinions, agreeing with your conclusions, even thanking you for correcting their mistakes. But with this came a new feeling, dominance not as punishment but as control over one's fate. I was no longer the unnecessary element of the family. I had become the central figure. And one night when I was in my home, looking at photos from my youth, I realized that the saga was evolving again. The parents who once erased me from existence now depended on me. This dependence gave me influence, but also required prudence. I understood that overly harsh maneuvers could destroy everything. At this stage, I learned the main thing. Dominance isn't punishment, not capital, not acknowledgement. Dominance is the ability to choose how to act, set boundaries, and influence circumstances while maintaining self-respect. I watched how my parents evolved, how they learned to value me. But ahead lay additional tests. My brother and sister, my parents' hidden goals, new financial shocks, and sudden twists that threatened to break everything I had built. And it was in that moment that I understood. The true saga is just beginning. Despite the fact that I had gained dominance over my parents' financial issues, the real challenge was only gaining momentum. My brother and sister, Thomas and Sophia, had no intention of simply accepting my influence. I knew they felt threatened, and it was mutual. I realized that any of their moves could be an attempt to restore control or test my resilience. Thomas showed up first. He suggested a frank meeting, though the tone of his message hinted at a threat. I sensed he was ready for a direct confrontation, but also looking for a chance to influence. We met in a secluded bistro where no one noticed us, and he got straight to the point. "You think everything's under your control now?" he asked, holding back rage. "What if I tell our parents I don't support your conclusions?" I looked at him coolly and said, "You can say whatever you want, but if the conclusion concerns the budget or the company, it won't take effect without my input. Period." His pupils dilated. He tried to smirk, but it came out forced. I realized his ego and ambitions had suffered. Thomas had always seen himself as the main heir, and now I was undermining that. "You have no right," he began, but I interrupted. "I do, not because I'm spiteful or crave punishment, but because you both ignored me all my life. Now I have a chance to fix things, not for myself, but for all of us." Sophia, my sister, showed more cunning. She chose the path through emotions. Her initial maneuver to evoke guilt in our parents toward me, accusing me of excessive severity and intruding into family matters. But I anticipated this step. I carefully tracked, documented, collected evidence of who and how was trying to direct events. Deep down, I understood. To maintain influence, I need not just oppose them, I need to outmaneuver them. I introduced a transparency mechanism. Any financial operation, any significant deal or decision about property now went through me. My parents hesitated at first, but over time, they saw that it really helped stabilize their position. However, personal emotions complicated things. Deep inside, I realized that this whole game wasn't just about capital. It was about acknowledgement, respect, and self-determination. Every time my parents expressed gratitude, I felt a mix of satisfaction and pain. After all, these same people had ignored me for decades. One evening, I received an unexpected call from my parents' lawyer. He reported that new financial documents had surfaced, obligations, secret assets, and agreements that could turn the picture upside down. I felt a slight chill in my chest. These documents could destroy everything we had created. I immediately summoned my parents to me. Their faces paled, eyes wide. They knew I was aware. "We tried to handle it ourselves," Mom began, but I interrupted. "You didn't try, you hit it. Now the situation is critical. We need to act together." It was in that moment that I first felt I could become the true head of the family. Not through dictatorship, but through tactical leadership and information management. My parents looked at me with respect, and at the same time with concern. The following weeks were intense. I worked on restructuring obligations, corrected mistakes they made in efforts to hide the truth, and at the same time encouraged them. But my brother and sister didn't back down. They exploited any vulnerabilities, secret meetings with parents, complaints about me, pressure through relatives. I knew the typical reaction, anger or resentment, but I behaved differently. I accumulated all evidence of their efforts to influence but didn't use it immediately. Instead, I strengthened transparency. Any steps were discussed publicly, any financial operation was registered. This way, I not only protected myself but also taught my parents to cope with influence. And then came the turning point. One day, Thomas tried to quietly transfer a portion of funds from the parental account to his project. I noticed it through a notification that came to my device. When I contacted Thomas, he first denied, then justified. "It's just an investment," he said. "I thought you wouldn't mind." "You thought wrong," I replied coolly. "Any deal without everyone's approval will be canceled, and that's the norm for everyone." Thomas fell silent. I felt this was the first significant triumph. Not punishment, not humiliation, but simply setting norms of behavior where everyone knows the boundaries. But the emotional side of the saga complicated further. My parents began to open up. They shared how hard it was for them to accept their mistakes, how they regretted neglecting me and my achievements. I listened, and although part of me wanted to cry, I maintained a detached gaze. It was necessary to not lose dominance. One night, when I was alone in my home, I began compiling a list of all instances where my parents tried to direct me. I understood. To maintain weight, I need to be a tactician, not an emotional player. This gave me a sense of inner endurance and power. But the true test lay ahead. Sophia, learning about my approaches, chose another path. She tried to sway one of their business partners to hide the parents' financial fragility. I found out about it through an indirect channel, a coincidence that later became decisive. I summoned my parents, laid out the circumstances, and we jointly made a decision. The whole family must function as a unit, or the outcomes will be dire. This was a moment of truth. They realized that my role wasn't just in restoring the budget, but in uniting the family. After that, the pressure eased a bit. Thomas and Sophia gradually began to accept my decisions. My parents started showing genuine gratitude and respect, and I first felt that I could trust them, though cautiously. It was in this phase that I understood the main thing. Dominance isn't punishment, not capital, not oversight. Dominance is the ability to influence circumstances, protect yourself and the family, set boundaries, and at the same time maintain respect for others. But despite the temporary calm, I realized ahead await even tougher tests. New financial shocks, sudden actions by my brother and sister, old obligations, legal disputes, all this could destroy the fragile balance I had built over months. And it was then that I first understood the true saga is just beginning. After I had gained dominance over my parents' financial issues and began protecting them from Thomas and Sophia's influence, life suddenly lost predictability. It seemed like I had mastered the situation, but the real tests were only gaining strength. The first alarming sign was a call from the credit organization. Their tone was formal, almost soulless. "We have detected an attempt to withdraw a large sum from one of your accounts." I immediately guessed it was Sophia. She acted secretly, counting on invisibility. I felt a mix of rage and resolve. This was a test of my endurance. I recorded the conversation, prepared evidence, and informed my parents. They saw for the first time that I could protect their interests not only with intellect but with an iron grip. My status grew, but with it, the tension in the family increased. Thomas, learning about Sophia's interference, changed tactics. He stopped hiding his efforts to influence and began publicly debating my decisions. He demanded risky investments that could ruin the company. "You don't understand," he insisted. "I know how to increase income, you're too cautious." "I understand much more than you think," I replied coolly. "But I also know that risk must be controlled or we'll lose everything." He would fall silent, but deep down I felt the next confrontation was inevitable. It was in this phase that the emotional struggle began. My parents, who previously saw me only as an assistant, started opening up. Mom confessed that decades of neglecting my efforts were not only her mistake, but also the result of external pressure, personal fears, and her own indecisiveness. "We were afraid you wouldn't handle it," she said one evening. "We thought Thomas and Sophia were better equipped." I listened and realized this was an attempt to apologize. But at the same time, I felt it was a sincere revelation. For the first time in many years, she was voicing my qualities, not just comparing me to my brother and sister. With each day, the pressure on me intensified. Sophia tried to influence my parents through emotions, Thomas, through logical arguments and warnings, and I was in the epicenter, between the desire to protect the family and the need to maintain dominance. One night, Mom called me, her voice trembling. We received a notice from the lawyer. They want to declare part of the obligations invalid. But for that, your decision is needed. I understood this was a moment of truth. If I accept their proposals, it could preserve some resources but open the way for new influences. If I reject, I risk finally breaking trust. I chose a tactical approach. I invited my parents to a bistro where we could calmly discuss matters. I laid out all alternatives, showed the outcomes of each option, explained the risks and benefits. They listened, sometimes interrupting, sometimes agreeing, but it was clear that for the first time, they felt the decision was truly mine. "We rely on you," Mom finally said, "but it's scary." "Fear is natural," I replied, "but we need to act logically, and I guarantee I'll save as much as possible." The following days were difficult. I made decisions that transformed the family's life. Some relatives didn't like it, and I felt pressure from everywhere. But gradually, I understood that true power isn't dominance over individuals, but the ability to direct the outcomes of their actions. Thomas didn't capitulate. He tried to intimidate me with warnings, hinting that he could challenge my decisions in court. I listened and realized emotions wouldn't help. I need to act methodically. I accumulated all documentation, all messages, all records of conversations and consultations with lawyers. Now, if he goes to court, I'll be equipped. Sophia acted more subtly. She tried to engage my parents' old contacts to create the appearance of external support. But I foresaw this. Every one of her maneuvers was documented, and my parents themselves began to discern her real intentions. It was in this phase that I first felt I could become the true leader. Not through dictatorship, not through fear, but through tactical leadership, transparency, and sincerity. My parents began turning to me not only for help, but for advice. They saw me for the first time as someone capable of protecting them and the family. But the emotional side of the saga was even more tangled. I began feeling that part of me still craved punishment for decades of neglect, for ignoring my triumphs. This feeling was strong, but I learned to restrain it. I understood that punishment destroys not only others, but also oneself. The true test came suddenly. One evening, I received a call from the lawyer. My parents' company was under threat of imminent bankruptcy. The cause was not only hidden debt, but also mistakes that Thomas and Sophia tried to hide or fix themselves. "We need your help immediately," the lawyer said. "Otherwise, everything will be lost." I understood this was the key moment. If I fail, the outcomes will be dire. If I act correctly, I can not only save the company, but also finally establish balance in the family. I summoned my parents, Thomas and Sophia. We gathered at my parents' home, where for the first time in a long time, everyone united. I spread the papers on the table, outlined the tactics, and proposed a plan of action. In that moment, something amazing happened. My parents listened to me without interference, without skepticism, without anxiety for the first time. We started. I coordinated every maneuver, corrected mistakes, directed financial flows, consulted with lawyers. Thomas and Sophia, seeing the effectiveness of my actions, gradually began to cooperate, though their egos hurt. Over several weeks, we stabilized the situation. The company was saved, obligations partially restructured, financial transparency established. But the main thing, the relationships in the family transformed. My parents began to see me as someone capable of making decisions and leading the family. And that's when I understood the main thing. True power isn't punishment, not capital, not oversight. It's the ability to make difficult decisions, protect those you value, and at the same time maintain sincerity and respect. Confrontations with my brother and sister didn't vanish completely, but became manageable. I learned to anticipate their moves, maintain coolness, and use information tactically. My parents, for the first time, felt they could rely on me not only as a child, but as a leader. And it was in that moment that I first realized Life isn't about who's right, but about how you use your abilities to protect and build, not destroy. But even then, I realized the saga wasn't over. New tests await ahead, new mysteries, new challenges. And only time will show how strong our family has become and how equipped I am for further maneuvers.